So welcome everyone. I'm Andrea and I am a nutritionist and fermentation enthusiast as well as an herbalist, and I am here to speak with you today about the role of fermented foods and gut flora and how that plays an important part of your health. So I'm really excited because this is a topic that I've been learning about and implementing for our family for the past decade, and it's been life-changing for us. It's something that I feel is probably one of the most essential pieces that came through human evolution and through every culture across the globe, and has only very recently sort of been forgotten in order to make things faster and more convenient. We've sort of put aside a lot of our traditional food practices that involve fermentation and eating cultured foods. So every being could be likened basically to being our own planets. So I would be planet Andrea, and you would all be your planet, and you are home to trillions of microbes. We actually have more microbes populating our personal planets than we have cells that make us who we are. And it's many, many, many times more. So we are more bacterial than we are actually human when we talk about how many cells versus how many numbers of bacteria. So there are about, on average, it's estimated 39 trillion microbes populating you. And so just to give you a number or an idea of what a trillion is, 1 trillion is 1 million times a billion. So there's about 39 trillion little microbes that call you their home planet. So we all have very unique flora living in us, and that has a lot to do with our ancestry and what our ancestors were eating, and it has a lot to do with what we are eating now. So while genetics does play a role, so does the food that you are eating on a daily basis. And you can change your diet and you will start to change and favor the various populations of bacteria that can start to call you home. So our intestinal tracts, when they're healthy, they're home to a very, very wide range of microorganisms, mostly bacteria and yeast, but we have some viruses and parasites sometimes that are playing almost an important immune function in there as well. So the question I want everyone to ask themselves is, are you making a really wonderful home and planet for these microbes, or are you maybe making kind of a planet like maybe the humans have done to ours, where there's a lot of destruction and pollution going on that potentially could be favoring organisms that are not in line with creating a very healthy planet that is you. So you can almost compare your body if you had a very clean flowing river and absolutely pristine forests and those kind of communities that would want to live in that environment, versus maybe some clear cuts where there's been environmental pollution and you've got a lot of toxic, sludgy stagnation going on. So you're going to favor two very types of ecosystems at that point. And it's similar with our bodies. If we are doing things that are promoting health of our environment, then we invite really thriving communities of diverse microbes. If we are doing things that damage and cause stagnation and damage to our forests and our rivers and our oceans, metaphorically in our bodies, then we can be inviting different microbe populations that might be attracted to that environment but aren't giving us that mutually beneficial relationship that we have co-evolved to have with certain microbes over others. So there's a theory in medicine, and it was proposed by Antoine Béchamp, and he called it the terrain theory. And that is, a diseased body will attract germs to come as scavengers to clean up that environment. And most of our current beliefs about medicine are rooted in something that's the opposite, called germ theory. And germ theory states that microbes are causing the disease, period. Germ theory completely ignores the actual terrain and living environment of these bacteria. So I'll let you listen to the facts that I'm going to present today, and you can make up your own mind about which theory is likely to be closer to the truth when it comes to health or just the absence of disease. So let's bring our focus back to the intestinal tract. I'm going to flip up my little quick cartoony sketch that I have done representing the human digestive tract. So each healthy adult carries about 1.5 to 2 kilograms of healthy bacteria in our guts. So that's quite a lot of just microbe community per weight that's just living in here. So we have what's kind of a barrier. So we've got your esophagus, and then it goes into your stomach, and then your small intestine, large intestine, and out. But it's almost like this tube is not really in your body. It is the inside outside. I heard it phrased by another colleague of mine, which is a perfect metaphor, because not necessarily everything that goes inside of you when you eat is going to actually get into your body. It's almost like a donut, and this is the hole, and we're putting things in here, and our body gets to say whether or not they get absorbed in. And that happens mostly, there are a few things that are absorbed in the stomach, but it's primarily the small intestine where our nutrients and things are absorbed, and then the colon deals with mostly fluid. So all along the outside of your body, the inside of your body, you have microbes living there, and they are producing a lot of different constituents, but mainly acid. They create what's known as like an acid barrier. So if you are doing things that are removing the bacteria, you're also removing the protection that they give you, because healthy, what we think of as our healthy probiotics give us that acidic protection, because the microbes that would otherwise cause disease don't like an acidic environment. They thrive in alkalinity. So if they come in contact with these acidic membranes and surfaces, they cannot easily set up a home there on us. They are crowded out. It's not an easy place for them to live, and they just get shoved aside, and then the healthy populations are thriving. And they are producing many, many other things, which we'll talk about, that don't allow for these potential pathogenic microbes to cause illness. But your acid barrier is sort of one of the first functions of these microbes, is that they create a pH and therefore set the environment that others can either come and co-create this beautiful ecosystem that is your intestinal tract, or if you don't have the right balance going on, then it sets the stage for opportunistic or possible pathogenic bacteria to come and sit down and take up residence. Where were we here? So in healthy people, your intestinal tract, if it was all straightened out, would be like a tube. But to increase the surface area, the entire tube has these little hair-like cells or structures called villi. And those are where your nutrients are coming in. And these villi are simply there so that we can, instead of having just a straight tube, you've increased the surface area hundreds and hundreds of times over. And each of these villi have microvilli, so they're even more little hair-like projections. And then they all have basically seats called receptor sites on the surface cells so the surface cells of your digestive tract are called the endothelium. So if you had one endothelial cell, you've got little chairs almost, and they're receptor sites for bacteria. So we actually are encouraging, and we need some sort of bacteria filling up these seats. And what humans have evolved to live with is ones that want to live with us if we're creating the right environment for them. And then we have a mutually beneficial relationship where we depend on them for a lot of our nutrition, but also for protection from other disease organisms. And then we'll talk about all the other magical things that they do as well. But it's like musical chairs in here. So you want these beneficial microbes filling up all of these seats. And if you've taken antibiotics, or you're under a lot of stress, or you're consuming a very high sugar diet, or food that's laced with antibiotics, or food that's laced with a lot of herbicides and pesticides that are designed to kill microbes, then some of these bacteria can be hurt and injured, or due to what we're eating, we can be favoring things like yeast or favoring other microbes. And so when those other guys come and sit down in our game of musical chairs in here, they aren't going to provide us with the same protection and the same benefits as our healthy symbiotic relationship to those bacteria that are good for us do. So we've got something that's called a biofilm. And a biofilm is essentially a community, and it's a symbiotic community of a very diverse group of bacteria and beneficial yeasts that are living together and coating the entire intestinal tract. So we have examples in our bodies of biofilms that maybe aren't the ones that we want, like dental plaque. Dental plaque is a biofilm. But in your intestinal tract, you want a biofilm, and it's just a whole layer, an entire layer of beneficial bacteria and yeast that are sitting there and creating essentially they set the stage, and they're creating the foundation, if you will, for building those healthy communities that are not allowing things we don't want to get in to come in. So normal gut flora, they provide a major source of energy and nourishment for the cells that line the digestive tract. So these villi and microvilli have all these enterocytes, and these are the digestive cells of our digestive system, and they are exposed to an incredibly harsh environment. Probably, other than the surface of your skin, they're exposed to the most diverse range of different chemicals and microbes and different pHs and all kinds of things going on. So they require a lot of energy to do their work of pulling in the nutrition that our body needs to build the homes or planets that we are. And so they derive what's estimated to be 60 to 70% of their energy from these bacteria. So these bacteria are actually making the nutrition that these cells use to do their work. So no good bacteria, your digestive system is already half or less likely to be able to absorb the nutrients from the food that you're eating. So enterocytes are working really, really hard all the time. So they have to be constantly replaced so that they're nice and young and able to do the work that they're doing. So they're born down here, and then they end up coming up to the surface, and then good bacteria slough these old dying cells off. But they've done animal studies where they sterilize the gut, and these old sick cells, when those good bacteria weren't there, those old cells were not removed. So they end up turning cancerous and have growths and weird things happening because they're sick and they're old and they need to, be recycled and life needs to continue on. But when we interrupt that natural cycle, that doesn't happen the way that it needs to with these bacteria sitting there. So good bacteria in the gut, they also produce antibiotic-like substances, and those antibiotics deter possible pathogens that could be coming in on our food and water, or when we touch things and we touch our face or those things. They also produce antifungal volatiles, so they are limiting the different yeasts or funguses or molds or different fungal microbes that we could be encountering. They also produce antiviral substances, including interferon, lysosome, and surfactants that dissolve membranes of viruses and some bacteria. So they're directly also engaging with our immune system so that we can respond appropriately to invaders. So when we do consume something that might be a pathogen, our bacteria in our gut are actually able to alert the immune system before we even might otherwise have known something was happening. So they can sound the alarm and they can say, you need to make such and such and such, we're dealing with this going on. So they're lowering the pH in the gut, we talked about that, to about 4 or 5, making it inhospitable for pathogenic bacteria that prefer an alkaline surrounding. They also neutralize nitrates, indols, phenols, scatol, xenobiotics, and other harmful compounds that might be in our food. They inactivate histamine and they chelate heavy metals and other poisons. So they've done a lot of other studies that, for example, children, when they don't have intestinal flora, or even adults, you will absorb a lot more arsenic out of your food than if you had your healthy intestinal flora. It'll stop you from being able to absorb those heavy metals that may or may not be in the food. So just because we ate it, again, it doesn't mean we'll absorb it, and our intestinal bacteria are largely protecting us from things that we don't want to come in. So they're really intelligent in helping make us a healthy home so that they can keep living here. So the cell walls of good bacteria also absorb carcinogens and they inactivate them. So carcinogens are substances that can cause cancer, and we know that good bacteria are helping us deactivate, and they're taking that hit just on our behalf, and they will absorb those chemicals into themselves, neutralize them, and they can be shed out without ever being absorbed by us. So they also suppress the hyperplastic process in the gut, and that's the basis of cancer cell formation. So in so many ways, they are protecting us from a lot of other diseases that we otherwise, are fairly common in our culture. And if we really focus on these microbes, they have designed this great relationship where they are protecting us on all sorts of fronts that we're just not aware of in our everyday lives. So another really awesome thing that they do is they digest our foods, and they work specifically on fibers that we can't really break down, and they convert that to beneficial substances. They create a lot of omega-3 fatty acids, antioxidants, and they produce a lot of enzymes that we get to utilize in our digestive process. They produce almost half of our daily vitamin K intake. They produce a lot of B vitamins, and though they do produce some vitamin B12, it's not likely that we actually get a lot of that B12 they're producing, because all of the bacteria in our gut need vitamin B12 to do their metabolism work, their metabolic work. So they are using most of the B12 that they do produce. So as far as those species of microbes that are living in our guts but not creating disease, they're more in small numbers and they're opportunistic. There are around 500 various species of microbes in that group known to science so far. We're identifying more all the time. And they can be found in the human gut, and they're considered opportunistic because when the ecosystem and the internal environment is healthy, our good bacteria that we rely on the most don't allow them to get into any significant numbers. So their numbers remain relatively small, and there's a lot of evidence that those opportunistic bacteria, even though they're living there in small numbers, are actually helping the immune system. It's only when they get overgrown because of an opportunity like antibiotics or the wrong kinds of foods being regularly consumed that they have potential to cause disease. So each of those 500 or more various species is capable of causing various health problems if they get out of control. So those would be bacteroids, peptococci, staphylococci, streptococci, bacilli, clostridia, certain yeasts, enterobacteria, that would be like Proteus, Klebsiella, citrobacteria, and then fusobacteria, eubacteria, catenobacteria, and some others. And then we've got transitional flora. So these are microbes that we swallow daily with our food and drink, and they're usually non-fermenting gram-negative bacilli from our environment. So transitional flora also can be eaten on fermented foods, and a lot of the bacteria in fermented foods doesn't actually start taking up residence in our bodies, but it's doing a lot of good work while it's coming through, because you can imagine you eat a bunch of sauerkraut or some kefir or some kombucha, and as those huge numbers of good bacteria are going down, they are interacting with your gut flora, and they are helping create the right environment and helping crowd out any microbes that we don't want there. So the more regularly we're consuming transitional flora that it is helpful ally to our good bacteria, the more we can help our intestinal environment really build a thriving probiotic community. So when the gut is well inhabited by beneficial flora, then the transitional flora passes through without doing any harm, even if some of the transitional flora could contain potential microbes that can cause ill health. But if not, that is when you can get more, serious food poisonings and things like that. It's when you've left yourself susceptible by not having a whole bunch of protection here in the form of good bacteria. So the transitional microbes that we eat, even if they are what we as humans would consider harmful or pathogenic, they actually are fairly benign, and they do help teach our immune system. So from the time we're babies, we're always putting things in our mouths, all the rocks and sand, and that's how a baby interacts with the world. And all of those microbes that are coming in, we now know, and they call it, what do they call it? There's a theory that's come out now that we know that children who are kept from exposing themselves at young ages to dirt and bacteria and microbes are actually more likely to have severe allergies and problems than children who ate the sand and ate the dirt and put all the things in their mouths, because they were training their intestinal flora and their immune system to be able to be more and more resilient and be able to recognize what they have to react to and respond to, and what is okay not to respond to. And a baby's immune system and children's immune systems, that's actually a harder task, is trying to figure out what they don't need to be responding to versus what they do have to consider is a harmful pathogen of some kind. So bacteria do something else really cool when we are consuming them. Bacteria, and this is all bacteria across species, they literally trade DNA with each other. So they will take out little segments of themselves and they will give it, or even send it as little packages and leave it to be picked up by one that's interested in that particular segment. So they are always teaching each other, and that's why antibiotic resistance has been such a huge and faster than we could ever imagine problem, because they're all, as soon as one bacteria figures out how to become resistant to something, they teach all of the other bacteria in the environment. So they're very, very good at collaboration and working together, something that we could learn from. So they have things called plasmids, transposon, and integrons, and those are all various sort of DNA pieces that they're sharing and teaching each other. And that's part of the adaptation. So it's something really cool too. So Japanese populations that have been eating from seaweed as part of a very, very long tradition in their culture for their diets, there is a bacteria that lives on certain seaweed, and that bacteria has figured out how to produce an enzyme that breaks down that seaweed for its nutrients. The gut populations of Japanese people only, so far it's been found, their own intestinal flora now produces that same enzyme to break down constituents in that seaweed. And that's because those bacteria were able to exchange information that they were eating on the seaweed, and the bacteria on the seaweed taught their own intestinal flora how to produce that enzyme. And that is happening all the time, and that's why eating the foods that your ancestors ate for generations and generations are going to be more suited to you than eating something that is not traditionally part of your culture. It doesn't mean we can't eat these things and have them be healthy parts of our diet. It just means that because of microbial exchange and our intestinal flora and our DNA, that what our ancestors ate for a long time, we are well adapted to eating. So there's another example too of how fast these organisms are able to teach resistance mechanisms. And there was a study done at a farm where they had chickens, like a factory chicken farm, and they had chickens that were in this one barn, and they had chickens outside in this other barn, and they fed one of the chicken groups in the barn antibiotic in their food. And then they measured both groups of chickens, and it only took a couple of days before both of the feces contained bacteria that were already resistant to the antibiotic. And to fast forward, it only took less than 2 years before not only the family who lived on the farm had bacteria in their bodies that were resistant to that antibiotic, even though they had no contact with the chickens, but the entire village and community now had resistance a year later to the antibiotics that they were trying to feed. And when bacteria create resistance to one antibiotic, at the very same time, they seem to anticipate that something else similar could try to take them out. So they create resistance to several other, and up to a dozen, studies have shown, new antibiotics that we haven't even invented yet. And then they teach each other all how to do it. So we've been dumping antibiotics and chemicals willy-nilly on our food and into our bodies and into our water for the last 80 to 100 years. And we really had no idea what the long-term impacts would be. Microbiologists and people who study human health, even Pasteur and the first people who started working with microbes, they were already warning that that was a potential, but we didn't listen. And now we know that we really have to change our paradigms and how we think of these things, because it's not, being at war with these microbes or having to have complete control over all of them that's going to fix it. It's how do we encourage the environment to be healthy and thriving so that these microbes are not creating a problem. And we know that in nature, when, say, a tree is diseased, it'll actually send out chemical signals to invite microbes to come and break it down and recycle it back into the environment. And it can do that with one limb, or it can do it with the whole tree. And often, through the mycelial network, other plants and other trees in the community can help heal that tree or help heal that plant. But if that tree is sort of beyond help and it's time to go back, it doesn't, the tree doesn't think of microbes as these, horrible, end of all, they're coming to kill me. It actually invites them and knows that the cycle of life is doing its most important role. So thinking about lessons from nature and what's happening, I don't believe that human beings are excluded from this rule of nature. And I think that if we are creating a terrain that is not in line with these good bacteria that we've evolved with over hundreds and thousands of years, then we are inviting in other microbes that are not in that same symbiotic relationship. And I don't think that they're coming in because they intentionally want to cause us harm. They're just doing their scavenging role. They're coming in because nature asks them to. It's like when you have a bowl of sugar or white flour and you add water and you stir it up, yeast comes in and it breaks that down and it cleans it up. And when we have yeast overgrowth in our body, it's maybe not the fault of the yeast, but that we're eating so much carbohydrate or sugar, and our own intestinal flora doesn't like that as a food source. So there's more sugar than we can deal with, and so yeast is cleaning it up. And so it's not the fault of the yeast for causing yeast problems. It's kind of the fault that we've created their perfect home and their perfect food source, and they're trying to just clean up all this excess sugar for us. So it's not necessary to blame the microbe when it's only doing its biological function. So harmful bacteria, like I mentioned before, they are directly competing for receptor sites on our mucosal cell surface. And we want to make sure we're constantly creating a home that is ideal for these beneficial symbiotic flora so we can discourage those pathogens. Because when those pathogens are sitting here, they're not creating nutrients for you, they're not making energy for your cells, and often they are literally pooping things that our body consider toxic into our bodies, which are then being absorbed and further impacting us, and then we have to deal with them in the liver or the kidneys and get them back out of the body. So not only are these microbes, potentially causing illness in the intestinal tract, but they can be taking away from vital nutrition that our entire system needs to function and then adding more of a burden. So we really do want to encourage really healthy bacteria to come and live in us. So the healthy ones that we've adapted with, that we consider our probiotics, those are the bifidobacteria, the lactobacteria, the propionobacteria, and physiological strains of E. coli, Peptostreptococci, and Enterococci. So it actually is funny, we always think of E. coli as food poisoning, but there are good strains of E. coli that are meant to be in our guts. And there are a lot of sources out there that are showing that it's when we are deficient in those communities that we are more likely to be able to get sick from the other E. coli. So the easiest way to favor these good bacteria is to consume a lot of fermented foods. They are literally alive with flavor and nutrition, and fermented foods are giving you a lot of that transitional flora that's going to help crowd out and set the stage and make a good foundation for our good bacteria that are inherently evolved to be with us to come back and take up residence. And we now know that the appendix, this is the colon, not the appendix, but our appendix in the body is a reservoir of good bacteria, so that if you get a really violent bout of diarrhea or something like that that really cleans you out, the good bacteria in you can come back and repopulate. So even if you've been on really devastating rounds of antibiotics and you don't have that flora left, just by eating fermented foods regularly in your diet, you can help encourage that recolonization of the digestive tract. And some fermented foods, like milk kefir, are more likely to have strains of yeast and bacteria that we need that will take up residence versus, things like kombucha. While it has benefits, they're less likely to take up your body as a home. But they still, while we're consuming them, set that environmental stage and foundation for what we need. So stress also plays a huge role. A lot of people under chronic stress will end up developing dysbiosis, which is an imbalance of the flora that live in your gut. So dealing with stress, if you're doing all the right things through diet and you're taking a lot of good bacteria in on your foods and you're still having problems, helping deal with stress and chronic stress is also an important piece of that puzzle. And we also know that if you're having a lot of anxiety or depression and mental health problems, that there is a direct relationship between the bugs living in your digestive tract and your brain, and that's called the gut-brain axis. And our digestive system has its entire own nervous system, and that's called the enteric nervous system. And a lot of the neurotransmitters and feel-good hormones and chemicals that our body needs at the brain level are produced in the gut, but only under conditions of having those symbiotic beneficial microbes. So if you have a lot of anxiety or depression or those sort of mental health challenges, then addressing your diet and the communities of microbes living in your gut is a really, really important piece of that puzzle. Other things we didn't mention yet. So the reason that a lot of people started producing fermented foods was not because they were aware of all of these amazing health benefits, but simply that it tasted good and it would preserve that food so that they could store what they were growing or foraging for a long period. So in the fermentation process, not only are you preserving the food, but new nutrients are created, and other nutrients, especially minerals, are made more bioavailable. So they actually are ionized, so you'll be able to get nutrition out of your food in a much more easy way than if you hadn't fermented it. So you can think of just eating like a coleslaw versus eating sauerkraut. The sauerkraut will have undergone almost an alchemical process that's completely transformed and now has a lot of other benefits that weren't there before the fermentation process. So fermented foods and drinks also help promote digestion. It's a well-known fact that sick people always lack digestive juices, and that cancer patients always lack healthy intestinal flora. You do not see a cancer patient that has healthy intestinal flora. It just doesn't happen. So anyone who is dealing with these chronic illnesses really have to ask themselves what may be the root of the problem. And it might not, of course, nothing can be 100% identified as one thing, but coming back to the foundation of, are you able to absorb and break down your nutrition and properly eliminate your wastes? And the microbes that are helping us do this, are they present or not? And that's a really great place to start with. And then, of course, we start to, I feel like learning about the body and living in harmony with nature also leads us almost to that spiritual path of all the other things that come from that. So I don't want to stand here and say that health is only to do with what we're eating, because it's not. It's what we're thinking. It's what we're telling ourselves. It's where our beliefs are coming from. But this certainly is a strong foundation that I encourage anyone who's suffering from various health issues to start with. I think I mentioned this at the beginning, but every single culture across the globe has utilized fermented foods and beverages to promote health, improve the flavor and texture and qualities of their food. So that's true whether you go to the indigenous populations that lived in really cold climates and they had a lot of fermented fish product and fermented meats. And then whether you go to, the bottoms of South America to Australia to all throughout Europe and Asia, every single culture has had their traditional foods and beverages that they've fermented. And they were so important that people who have immigrated or traveled would always take their ferments with them above almost everything else in their household, because they knew that those traditions had been passed down for generation after generation, and they, even though they didn't have the scientific information, they knew intuitively how important those foods were for their well-being. And often, some of these fermented foods would be what would keep a family well throughout a winter when we didn't have refrigerators and all of the conveniences we have now. It could be life or death if you find a way to preserve that food that you were harvesting or growing throughout the season. So I always like to leave off on a metaphor too, thinking of seeds and how a lot of these viruses and bacteria are kind of like seeds. When they come into contact with you as the soil, they are able to take count of their environment and monitor it, but they only are able to awaken and sprout and grow there if the soil is fertile. So if you are not fertile soil for these viruses or bacteria, then they won't be able to take root and thrive and grow there. So, and you might have, a mild illness, but often when someone is really healthy, they can be infected with all sorts of things and never know it because they're completely asymptomatic. So it's really important to think about the fact that these microbes are not the only thing causing illness, because in a strong immune system and in a strong bodily environment, they aren't able to get established. The good bacteria and your immune system can deal with them very easily before they can ever cause too much harm. And of course there are exceptions, and I like to talk about invasive species because we know that some seeds are adapted to a wide range of soils and they can be very invasive. So yes, it's not all the environment, and yes, it's not all the microbe, but there is a strong relationship there, and focusing on making your own planet as thrivingly healthy as possible is going to set you up for the most success and your future generations. Because we know that whatever you're eating, especially as a mother, will affect up to 7 to 10 generations down the road. So it's really important just to consider that it's not only our own health that we're impacting. And I also like to plant the seed that whatever we are consuming has repercussions in the greater environment. So if you're eating foods that are sprayed with chemicals and herbicides and pesticides, hardly any of us can avoid that 100% now. So I don't want anyone to feel guilty, but those chemicals don't only affect that soil, they affect the water, and they affect the wildlife, and they affect the people that eat it, and then our future generations and all wildlife that comes in contact. So I feel like learning about taking care of ourselves also leads us in a very natural way to taking care of our whole planet on the broader scale. And that is the role of good bacteria in our intestinal tract. Is there any questions? Are there any questions? Yeah.
How much fermented food are you supposed to consume for a healthy flora? And is there good versus bad fermented food?
So all fermented foods will be better for you than non-fermented counterparts. Versus, there's not really a bad fermented food, although I would, beer and wine, those are not really fermented in the same way. So those would not be in the same class, because you're fermenting to get alcohol and you're not fermenting to get lactic acid and acetic acid and some of these other substances that encourage a diverse population of good bacteria, where alcohol actually, once you get to a certain level, will kill off a lot of other microbes, and then you're left with just yeast, and it's not a yeast that helps your body. So in moderation, fine, but not as a supplement or a probiotic. But most fermented foods started out as condiments, and that's kind of how they're consumed still. So if you have a couple tablespoons of a fermented food with each meal and a bit of a beverage, that's where you're looking. So you're not going to be having like bowls and bowls of sauerkraut, although you can work your way up if you enjoy it. You can't really have too much, but if someone's been eating like a McDonald's, KFC 3 times a day, and then they move to suddenly eating bowls full of fermented foods, they might have a lot of what's called a die-off reaction. As you rapidly start to kill off those other microbes, they release toxins, and you can sometimes start to feel sick or bloated or have reactions because there's so much activity happening. So,
describe the distinction in benefit between yogurt and kefir.
sure, yeah. So yogurt is, if you have a live culture yogurt, which means that it still is maintaining its species of good bacteria, it's really good for you. So there, of course, the Bulgarians are famous for their yogurt, and they've attributed that to why they have a longer lifespan. So you can get I can't remember what that strain is called, but all yogurt is, as long as it has live cultures and it isn't full of a bunch of sugar and other ingredients, is good for you. But kefir is a little bit of that next stage. So it has far more diversity as far as having bacteria and yeast strains that are helping to create a healthy intestinal environment. Also, all dairy products kind of form what they would call like mucus forming in a lot of traditional medicines, but the mucus that kefir forms is very clean in quality. And what I mean by that is that it's a healthy mucus that encourages that biofilm proliferation, and it sets the stage probably more so than any other fermented foods for having the microbes be able to come and settle down and start really healing. So even people who are lactose intolerant are often fine with kefir because it's so low. Almost all of that lactose has been turned into lactic acid, which doesn't give you the same reaction. And even people who are yeast sensitive or trying not to have yeast do fine on kefir. So it's probably just how I can say it's more therapeutic than yogurt. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yeah.
I do. I heard from somewhere that the glyphosate in Roundup acts as an antibiotic. So if there's residues in your food, it's not good for your stomach bacteria. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So these, a lot of these herbicides and pesticides are designed to kill microbes, and unfortunately, there are things happening in our agricultural or industrialized agriculture, really, that, for example, glyphosate is often sprayed on a crop right before harvesting so that it more quickly dries. So you're eating a crop that has very recently been sprayed and has a high contaminant level of glyphosate. So I know there are actually a lot of activists out there who are now testing our cereals and our porridge products, and our Honey Nut Cheerios and those brand names on the shelf are being found to have far, far higher levels of glyphosate than what has been set by regulating bodies. And this glyphosate, they will try to say it's completely harmless, but it's been labeled now a probable carcinogen by the World Health Organization, and the more studies that are coming out on it are saying that it's definitely not neutral and not doing anything. And if you look at what it's designed to do, which is kill microbes, of course it's going to affect our microbes too. And so, how susceptible you are is really going to depend on the other things that you're eating and your stress levels and your genetics. It can't be attributed to only one thing, but it's an important thing to think about is if you are consuming a lot of food that's contaminated with high glyphosate levels, then you will be affecting your own microbes. And yeah, from everything that we've talked about today, definitely not ideal if you're trying to build a really healthy gut ecology. Any other questions?
How do you feel about those probiotics you can buy in capsules?
Yeah.
And I just was recently buying some, and I found out that friend was just suggesting that they buy ones that are in the fridge, not on the shelf.
Yeah. So there are some that you can get on the shelf that are still going to infer a lot of benefits, and there are some in the fridge that don't infer a lot of benefits, or I think confer, anyways, they pass along a lot of benefits. So it really depends on the strains of bacteria, how it's grown. It's become sort of a trendy thing in the industry, unfortunately, and with that you're going to have some really high quality and you're going to have some that isn't. And so if you take a strain of bacteria, for example, that's, a weaker strain, and then a lot of them, they grow it and then they put it through processes that remove the bacteria from its growing medium. So if you think of sauerkraut would be full of good bacteria, and the cabbage is its home that it's been growing in. So that's its medium. If you isolated those bacteria from the cabbage and you tried to just swallow them in a capsule, you're not going to have the same protection from the stomach acid that you do when you eat it as a food, where it's in its matrix that it was growing and it has a lot of protection that way. So then you get into the world of enteric coating and these time release and all these complicated things. And while I think taking probiotic supplements absolutely can be really an important part of recovery for anyone who has been on a lot of antibiotics or is under really high stress or has dietary restrictions, or they have to travel all the time and they have a really hard time maintaining consistent meals, and they might be having to go to food deserts where all that there really is fast food, and those kind of scenarios, probiotic supplementation can be really, really important in helping people heal. But it's not, in my opinion, something that is necessary for every single person. I really believe in getting things from our food as much as possible, and if we can be eating regular amounts of fermented foods, then we'll be giving ourselves more bacteria than simply taking a probiotic could ever really give us. And now we're in the realm, I feel too, of really, humans, we are so in our heads and we think that we know everything, and that, if we don't know it, then we will know it, and we'll know it in a way that we know what's right and what's wrong. So we get, almost like our agriculture has become these giant monocrops of one variety. Now we see us trying to almost farm. We learned good bacteria existed, and we learned we could, manipulate the populations. And so now it's like we're isolating and monocropping and trying to engineer our own intestinal tracts. And I don't think it's necessary to try to engineer ourselves. I think that sometimes we might miss the point, where if we just eat a really diverse range of hundreds of different good bacteria, that our body will be able to trade those DNA, and our own bacteria will start residing there that is meant to be with us, and we don't have to worry about it. It will just happen automatically. So yes, they can absolutely have a lot of benefit, but not necessarily as a permanent must-have in the diet for those who are already relatively healthy and who are able to maintain, a healthy diet overall and are eating a lot of fermented foods.
What about kimchi?
So kimchi is an Asian variety of sauerkraut that is really spicy, and it's typically made with Napa cabbage. And so it's just another variation of a sauerkraut, and traditionally is a fermented food. We run the risk in our modern culture now of, when you go to the grocery store, you can often find like a sauerkraut or a kimchi in the canned food aisle, and that is not the same thing. So in effort for larger companies to make a product that tastes exactly the same all the time across the planet, or across the country anyway, then they do things like chop up the vegetable, add the vinegar, and can it. So you have the taste of vinegar and the taste of sauerkraut or kimchi without the health benefits. So anytime if you're buying sauerkraut or kimchi or fermented foods, you have to find those in the refrigerator section. And it should say live cultures on it, ideally. Sure.
This is what we said, when you introducing the live cultures, don't you eat on them?
Yeah, start with about a tablespoon at meals, with your breakfast, lunch, dinner sort of thing. If you really enjoy something, and then you can have more than that, but maybe don't have an entire bowl if it's very, very different from what you've been eating.
And then build up more.
You can, but I usually just stick to having a few tablespoons at the most with meals, and that's absolutely enough to help with digestion and give you a lot of good bacteria. So, yeah. Sure.
So my grandmother made the best pickles. You can figure how long ago that was, when I was 5-year-old, let's say. But some of those pickles were made with sugar, right? So are we just basically canceling the value?
If they're fermented pickles, there are some recipes where you can add a bit of sugar too and sweeten them. You can in the recipes, but if they're being canned and they're just like sugar, like my grandmother makes a sliced pickle that she's always made with white sugar and vinegar, and they're really yummy, but they're not fermented and they have absolutely no nutritional benefits beside what might be left in the cucumber after the vinegar and sugar has had its way with it. So thank you so much for coming, everyone, today, and I hope that you all enjoyed the information and that you're excited to go forth and start eating more fermented foods.